Today, Mysterion is going goth.
Like me in high school. Oh, yeah.
Sad but true. Two friends,
Two pastors.
two theologians,
Pursuing spiritual life
by exploring the scriptures.
in conversation with the fathers. I'm Dr. Wes Arblaster,
And I'm Dr. Ethan Smith.
and we are.
Mysterion.
So we're going goth today, huh?
We are going goth.
Yeah.
Now, you joked at the opening like you in high school or college, but
It's true. I was in a goth band. I was in
goth
like a
band.
yeah. I mean, painted face and dark eyeliner. I should show you some
I
pictures.
can see a painted face working for you.
Oh yeah, man. It was good stuff. It was good stuff. The other day, actually, in the car, I was like, "Hey kids, have you ever?" Because my band was Bicycle Grindstone, and so I was like, "You need to listen to Bicycle Grindstone," and they never heard it before. So we don't like have a CD player in our house. So the only CD player I have is the car. So I put it in the car, and I blew their minds.
I'm sure you did.
I was like, "What do you think, guys?" And they're like, "Well, it's pretty good, but it's you, Dad, and you're screaming." And usually my screaming is in a different context with them. So.
Yeah. Also related to death, maybe, but
The fear of death, the
yeah.
threat of death.
now I have a Bicycle Grindstone story. Like, you guys don't know this. I didn't know Wes in the Bicycle Grindstone days. The face paint had gone away. The screaming into the microphone mostly gone away by that point. And then one day I'm just driving my car and I pull out this CD case, and that tells you that this was a little while ago. And I was like, Bicycle Grindstone? What is this? And I'm like, I'm certain I've never bought this album. And I'm like, it seems vaguely familiar. I don't know. And I stuck it in, and sure enough, there was Pastor Wes screaming through my car radio speakers, and it's like, Bicycle Grindstone.
That's right. I still got a few CDs, and hey, believe it or not, there's a Bicycle Grindstone fan page on Facebook. I think there's like 4 people.
That seemed high.
And there are Bicycle Grindstone T-shirts and CDs floating around out there. Somebody posted online that they found one and they wanted to know what the band was.
We've got to link this to our YouTube page.
Yeah,
like,
man.
Channels subscribe to Bicycle Grindstone.
I will share some photos on the discussion group of me and in my Bicycle Grindstone phase. You guys will thoroughly enjoy them.
It's the most 90s stuff you've ever seen.
Oh yeah, but believe it or not, it's kind of relevant because most of our songs were about death, and today we're talking a little bit about death, right? I mean, it's kind of cool.
We are. We're going to
talk about death.
Actually, we're going to talk.
Let's talk about you and me. All right.
Freud would approve you using that song to sing about death, but that's a different topic. The little death. Okay. So we want to talk about something today. 3 things that go together. So I think for some of us who don't have a background celebrating Ash Wednesday or Lent, something might seem puzzling. We go into Lent on Ash Wednesday, where you go forward, someone puts ashes on your head and says, now this is a season of repenting from our sins. Oh, by the way, stop eating food or less food or only these foods. And those 3 things just kind of hang out there. What do ashes
fasting,
have to do with repentance, and what do either of those have to do with fasting, food restriction? And that's what we're going to talk about today, and we're going to learn there's a common theme between these 3 things.
I mean, biblically, there's a lot of different kinds of connections, of course, like repentance and sackcloth and ashes and things like that. But really, theologically, we're going to try to pull those things together around the common theme of death. Right, which is really, you said last week, you said, I'm going to talk about fasting in relation to death. So that's what we're getting into
That's
today.
what we're going to get to.
So the first thing, we want to talk, go ahead.
What we were going to say, it's not just death. We're not being morbid. It's about obtaining a kind of freedom in our relationship to death.
Yes.
That we're going to find binds these 3 things together: Lent, repentance, fasting.
Yeah, that's right. We don't want to just be morbid like my Bicycle Grindstone CDs, right? So what we're going to be talking about is the way that death is transformed in and through Christ. And our practice of Lent helps us do that. It carries us along in that journey whereby our relationship to death is transformed. Right?
So just to be clear with everybody, we're going to kind of go through a journey today through a passage in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians and then to his second letter of Corinthians. And we'll sprinkle in some stuff from the church fathers. But to be very clear, what we're going to be tracing is this relationship between Lent, repentance, and fasting, and how it all revolves around this kind of freedom in relationship to death. That's where we're going today.
Sounds good. Let's go.
Let's go.
So we're going to dive into 1 Corinthians?
Let's do that. So when we think about death and death is being destroyed, the classic passage we like to go to is 1 Corinthians 15. Let me pull that up here. 1 Corinthians 15, and we're going to read this, and I think many of us will be familiar with this passage. In fact, I think in our churches, this is often the way we most typically think about the overcoming of death. And so we'll explore this a little bit, dig into it a little bit, and then we're going to show how Paul kind of opens it up further in 2 Corinthians, which might be a little bit surprising, but I think there's really a liberating message in it. So I'll go ahead and read this and let you jump off with that wherever you want, okay?
Sounds good.
So this is Paul writing to the church in Corinth. Behold, I tell you a mystery. That's Mysterion. As I say, our podcast is all over the Bible.
Paul's preaching Mysterion,
exactly.
too. Sweet.
Behold, I tell you a mystery. We will not all sleep, but we will all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. For this perishable must put on the imperishable, and this mortal must put on immortality. But when this perishable will have put on the imperishable, and this mortal will have put on immortality, then will come about the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory.
Yeah. It's a good passage. I mean, one of the things I think, let's start at the 50,000 foot.
So you approve?
Here. I do. I think Paul's got something here. Got something going for him.
That's good.
So anyway,
Paul will be happy to know he has Wes's stamp of approval.
That's right. That's exactly right. I'm sure he's thinking, that was a close one.
Yeah. He's relieved.
But anyway, when we look at this passage, I would like to spend a little bit of time diving into the perishable and imperishable. But before we get there, let's just kind of look at the big picture. I think, generally speaking, Paul, in the most general sense, is laying out a hope that Christians have in common here. That the idea that death is an enemy, death is something that we seek to be freed from, and that through Christ's death, burial, and resurrection, we participate in a life to come. That in some sense, our life now will be transformed into a life where we will no longer experience death.
And I think it hooks up to our broader understanding of the Christian story that death is like an invasive alien force in God's creation. It's not what God intends, right?
Yeah.
It's the enemy.
It's the enemy, and that death will be overcome, and that's what our hope is. Now, everyone's kind of familiar with that general picture, right? And that's usually the one that we assume. Christ came to save us and free us from death, from sin, right? All of that. So, yes, but let's dive into it a little bit more, because the first thing that we should say is what Paul talking about here only death in the sense of what happens when my life ends? Or is there actually more going on here than that? And that's where we want to get into the perishable and imperishable. Notice that death here is swallowed up in victory, but look at the way that he's talking about how we actually experience death in ourselves or in our bodies. He uses two words, right? He uses perishable and mortal and contrasts that with imperishable and immortal. So mortal, I mean, Ethan, what does it mean to have a mortal body?
It's a body that dies.
It's a body that dies. So it's got a time limit on it, right? It's got an expiration date, right? So that's mortality, right? But then he also uses the word perishable, right? So perishable is getting at a little bit more, I think, experientially than mortality, right?
Yeah, with perishable, I get more of a sense of like decaying, rotting, like the process, the breaking down, right? Not simply the end product of mortality. Oh, there's an end point, but actually there's a process that takes you along the way to that point, right?
Yeah, so let's dig into this a little bit more, because I think there's actually a lot here, right? Because death if we think about a death as an enemy to be overcome, right? Here, that's going to be swallowed up in victory, right? Is that just something that happens at the end of our life? So we die and we know that's not the end. Or is in some sense death invading us, is more present to us in our life throughout our life than we're maybe not as commonly aware of. I think the imperishability thing really draws that to the surface, right? How close are we to death? Well, you'd say, well, I don't really know, but I hope maybe 30, 40 years. But in reality,
I mean, we would have to divide up our time here because you're probably a fair amount closer, given your advanced age.
Yeah, it's possible. And usually when we think about death, though, we think about it.
Would you have a bet on this if you recall from a couple?
That's right.
Ago?
That's right. You're gonna owe me 20. But anyway, so
you can pry it from my dead cold hands.
But anyway, it's not just the threat of death that that makes it. We say, well, I hope 30 years or whatever. But I could get in a car wreck tomorrow or something like that. It's not just that. Like our bodies themselves, we are always. I mean, if we look at food, we're several weeks from death. If we look at water, we're just. I mean, again. Even more
like 3 days.
Very much closer to death. If we think about breathing, we're talking about a couple of minutes. So death is something that is, how do I say it? The very way that our bodies are, they're perishable bodies in the sense that we have to keep drawing in nutrients, drawing in life to keep from dying. And even as Father Sylvia said the other day, we feed on death. So we have to actually eat organic matter. Other things have to die so that we can continue to live. There's a sense in which death shapes our lives on a daily basis, right? Precisely because our bodies have this character to them, right? They have this perishability condition to them. So death is something I think that is much more present to us. We don't think about it that way, but we're always trying in some sense to stave off death in a way, right? Through food. Do you have something to share about that or no? I don't want to keep talking.
Death bad. I don't have anything.
Well, think about it for a second. How is it related to food, right?
Well, yeah, certainly, right? We tend to think of death as something at the end of a long process down the road. But the reality is we're always managing our relationship to death all day, every day. We eat at least 3 times a day, usually. Breathing, all of these things are our relationship to it. It also makes itself felt, this perishability, this decay, in things like, body aches and illness and all these kinds of things.
But see, again, the thing is about it, though, is that's the condition, that's the human condition. That is what it means to be a human being.
We're perishable.
And it's not something like, how do I say it? It constitutes our being, we might say. It makes us what we are. Like what we do throughout the day. Right now, I'm breathing in air as I'm talking, right? That itself is due to this condition of constantly having to sustain myself so I don't basically die, right? It takes labor to keep... my whole self, every activity is in some sense conditioned by the perishability, right? The condition of death. That just sort of frames everything.
We are not non-perishable items.
Right, right. And as we get older, you start to feel it more and more and more. But it's inevitable, right? It's inevitable.
I'll trust you on that one.
Right? Eventually, that body is going to give out, right?
Yes.
Eventually, myself is going to give way to death that way. And that frames pretty much everything about me. So let's look back at this here for a second.
Including your rock music.
Including my rock music. So this is the thing. Death is swallowed up in victory here, but it seems like what he wants to be pointing to is in some sense, not just death as the end, but death as framing my life, right?
Oh, right.
Death as the very condition of my life, my very being.
And it makes me think about in Hebrews, where whoever wrote Hebrews talks about how Satan has power over us through the fear of death, right? And not simply through death, but through the fear of death. And I think in that passage there, it's not just this idea of I think about death and I get scared, but the way all of our lives are constituted precisely by negotiating this relationship,
right.
holding it back.
Right.
In some sense that, a lot of the way we are lost or we're far from God or far from life is not simply the fact that we'll die at the end, but precisely how we relate to this threat throughout our days, every day.
But in our culture, we tend not to be very aware of this. In fact, we kind of seem to want to push it away. We want to avoid it as much as possible. The fact that our lives are conditioned by death. It seems to me like Paul is much more aware and willing to kind of talk about it and face up to it than we are today. You know what I mean? For example, how much of our lives are an attempt to avoid death or push it out from view or keep our bodies going as long as possible. But we're all going to face the inevitable anyway, right? Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
it's
so
kind of a tragic. I guess there's kind of a tragic story
There's this sort of double thing we have in our culture, right? Where we work harder than any other culture to avoid dying, and yet we work harder than any other to avoid even thinking about it. So there's a sense in which we are overwhelmed by the fear of death precisely as we sort of deny its presence around us. So it's a state, I would say, a pretty heavy illusion, right, and avoidance.
So much of our lives, we're trying to keep our bodies healthy. We're trying to keep them strong. We're trying to last as long as we possibly can.
And to be clear, there's nothing wrong with trying to be healthy, right? We're not
Right. But there's trying to be healthy as a kind of an avoidance or a delay, right? Pushing that stuff back as much as possible so I don't have to face it.
Right.
But knowing that eventually this thing's going to take us, right? That we are going to, we're going to die, right? It's all of our battles are a losing battle that way, right? But what we have with the Christian story, and particularly Lent, is we have an actual conscious turning toward our mortality and our death, putting that kind of right up in front of us and saying, for example, on Ash Wednesday, from dust you came and to dust you shall return. Now, I told my kids about this. I talked to them about this, and they said, Dad, that's really morbid, right? And I said, no, it's not morbid at all. And we kind of ended up having an interesting conversation about it because on the surface, it sounds morbid to say the things that we're saying, right? Kind of putting it out there like this is going to happen. Our lives are conditioned by that. But what does that do when we actually turn to begin to face that stuff rather than just kind of have it lingering on the horizon, trying to avoid it?
Well, I mean, we can gain a more truthful relationship to it. But more than that, in the light of the Christian story, our whole relationship to it can become changed from one of a kind of captivity and fear to one of freedom, frankly, and power, really. Death can be, and not just death, but its extensions and things like various weaknesses we suffer, various pains we suffer, can go from simply being things that passively control us and victimize us to, as we will see, a kind of instrument by which we can work our transformation into the life of Jesus Christ. Lent is all about gaining a proper relationship to our pain, our weakness, and our dying, our perishability, such that it becomes transformative. It's not something we passively suffer or passively victimized by, but as we'll get to it, this sort of controlled practice of weakness, voluntarily, we learn how to, again, kind of use these things as an instrument of our transformation, or rather, let God use these as instruments of our transformation. And so the liberation from death, and I think this 1 Corinthians passage can make it feel like the liberation from death, just like death feels like it's out there, then the liberation from it will be after that.
Yeah.
And in Lent, and in the second passage we'll look at, we'll see how actually there's already this sort of undoing in our life today, and Lent is the time where we really focus on that, and we can, that being Satan having us captive by the fear of death. Lent is where we really focus on being liberated precisely from that fear.
Yeah, because just to be clear on this, when we start to fast, for example, just talking about fasting here, we start to really experience the perishability. We experience weakness, we experience hunger, we experience lack, we experience limit. Our bodies, it becomes much more apparent to us that our bodies are perishable. And again, we could say, well, that seems kind of morbid. Why would I do that to myself? This is the point, though. The truth is, we are perishable, and we are moving towards our lives are conditioned by this. So we can either try to avoid it as much as possible, and then finally suffer, right, and undergo it as victims as far as our perishability, or we could, in some sense, come face to face with it, become, how do I say it? Develop a kind of healthy, free, liberated relationship to our own perishability. And fasting begins to make that possible. Because we get, in some sense, get used to it, get comfortable with the fact that this is in fact who we are. Right?
And by perishability, we don't just mean that final outcome at the end. We mean the way decay, perishability haunts us every day, in stiff joints to anxiety over paying bills to all these things are ways in which perishability touches our lives. So this is about gaining a kind of freedom in relationship to that. Stop just being a passive victim to these things that inevitably, instead, we don't just pray that these things go away, because they're going to just keep coming at us. We actually learned to find a relationship to these things that's freeing. And by fasting, we kind of put ourselves face to face with it. When we stuff our faces all the time, and there's a time for that. There's a time for feasting and really, soaking in life to the full. But typically, when we just kind of numb ourselves every day by being full, we're kind of hiding from this perishable condition that we're in. And the fast is intentionally putting it before ourselves, not simply as an idea, but demonstrating it in our bodies. What a weak hold we have on life, right? What a weak hold we have. I
mean, you look at the typical lifespan, like of a 21st century person. You're kind of at your peak at 18, 19, 20. You're pretty good, and then you live until most people live till about 70, 80. I guess that's the average, right? It's mid 70s. That's the vast majority of our life is actually experiencing progressive loss, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And so the majority of our life is sort of moving towards this. It's this gradual motion towards decay. And we can try to hold that back and avoid it and pretend like it's not there and do all of that. Or we can realize there's something actually mysteriously hidden in that process of whereby we can actually experience freedom, life, and Christ himself through the, let's say, the 2/3 of our life, or the second half of life.
Yeah, and that that second half, or the second the final 2/3 of life, of course, there's full of all kinds of great, wonderful things. Obviously, we should be pursuing health so that we can serve others and the Lord well. But when you get to adulthood, you start to get haunted by these things, and if you're not prepared for it, it can kind of put you in a state of constant depression, because it's just things going wrong. And we think the only alternative to that is just kind of giving into it. But actually, a great deal of the gospel, and as we'll see here, particularly 2 Corinthians, is focused on harnessing loss, harnessing weakness in such a way that we gain a freedom in our relationship to this kind of inevitable decay. In fact, as a way of embracing God's life more and more, which is precisely the imperishable, the immortal.
Yes.
I don't know. Do we want to go to 2 Corinthians?
Yeah, let's go there. Let's dive in. And I think as we do that, I just want, you brought this up while we were talking before this, that, we tend to talk about perishable or mortal or weak or whatever, and then the imperishable, right? That we move towards in the resurrection, right? But we're going to, here there's like a deepening and a passage through.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what we want to kind of get into.
So to me, it's interesting that, the change in Paul's voice from 1 Corinthians to 2 Corinthians, he's talking to the same community. When he talks about these things in 1 Corinthians, there's, mortal and immortal, perishable, imperishable. It feels like a kind of before and after relationship. And he doesn't mean it this way, but we can tend to think of that as just a thing kind of out there in the future.
Right.
If you read through 2 Corinthians, you won't see it as much just in this passage we're going to look at. He talks more about inner and outer. the inner person versus the outer person. And decay and perishability is located on the outer, and immortality, life with God, is located with the inner. And by doing that, you can see how these things mysteriously coincide in this life and how they're related. And I think on some level, maybe Paul has to correct the Corinthians to see that how they can gain a proper relationship to their own suffering and weakness even in this life. And how the inner person can be renewed by Christ precisely, not simply instead of the sort of outer decay, but in and through it. It can be learned to have that relationship to it, and that both of these things unite us.
So to kind of sum up what you're saying, it would not be a good reading of 1 Corinthians 15, what we just read, but it's possible to read it in such a way that life sucks now. There's death and pain and all that stuff, but hey, hold on long enough, and later on, when we're on the other side, everything will be good.
Yeah, and there's two problems with that. One, that's not accurately what he's saying.
Right.
Two, the problem is also spiritual, existential. When you live in that story, your relationship to the pain in your body, to illness, to loss, is one precisely of just passive victim. Or the only way to get past it, to get over it, is to find just a medicine or something to get past it. Then you hope for the day where none of these troubles are around, which is in vain in this life, because these things are around.
It's inevitable.
It's inevitable. So if we stop with that misunderstanding of Paul from 1 Corinthians, it sets us up to experience all these things as passive victims.
Yes.
Whereas in 2 Corinthians, he dives more deeply into this to see how we can in and through Christ gain a relationship to these things as things, in some sense, to harness or find a right relationship to that unites us more and more into Christ, who is our life.
Okay.
Right?
So why don't we dive in? I'll read and then you can comment, yeah? So this is 2 Corinthians 4:10 and 11. He's speaking about himself, and I think right before this, he talks about we are stricken, we are perplexed, but we are not crushed. He goes through that catalog of all of these forms of pain and suffering and debilitation and weakness that he himself is experiencing, but recognizing in the midst of that there is a solid core, right? We are struck down but not destroyed. There's a center part of it that he's saying we are victorious in that way. And then in verse 10, he's speaking of himself, always carrying about in the body the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our body. For the living are constantly being handed over to death through Jesus, so that the life of Jesus also may be manifested in our mortal flesh.
Yeah, so this is, without doubt, one of my favorite passages in all of Scripture. I could go on about this for way more time than we have, just breaking down different parts. I really believe that in our day and age, in our culture, which is one beset by record numbers of depression and anxiety, 2 Corinthians is really a central book of Scripture for us to understand that could get us past precisely the mindset and the practices that produce that anxiety and depression. But it's difficult. It's difficult. So we have here, what's clearly on the face of it is this idea that both in our dying and in our rising, it's not simply us, right? It's that all of our hardships, all of our weaknesses, all of our suffering, all of our dying is itself now included in the dying of Jesus. And then therefore all of our rising. So our rising after we literally die, but all the many victories we can experience in our Christian life now. So it's not the case now simply that I undergo loss, I undergo suffering, and then I hope God will do something for me. It is rather what God in Christ has done has included all of my physical, mental, emotional pain, illness, weakness, dying, death, all of that has been included in the very life of Jesus Christ. It's not simply that we have the same rhythm, hey, God died as a human being and so will I. It's that, so to speak, in Jesus Christ's offering of himself to his Father, my life, including the pains, have been included in that offering. So even these things are uniting us to him.
Yeah.
But I want to back up first, because I think our experience of these things, when we first begin to fast or try to get a proper relationship to our pain and suffering, at first it doesn't feel like that's what's uniting us to him. So if I want to step back and take a broader look at 2 Corinthians and at Paul's understanding of his own relationship to Jesus Christ. So Paul has famous passages like in Galatians where he says, I no longer live, but Jesus Christ lives in me. Right? And then in Philippians, he talks about not having a righteousness of my own, but one from Christ. What's really clear about Paul, you can understand in him what he thinks is the biggest divider between himself and Jesus Christ is Paul, right? Trusting in his own power. Paul's own life that he has separate from Christ, his own holding on to his own abilities, that separates from him from Jesus Christ. And he's come to see those experiences of loss, of weakness, of pain as kind of an educative process. It educates us into loosen our grip on ourselves so to be filled with the life of Jesus Christ. And he tends to start viewing death itself, which in 1 Corinthians he talks about it as the final enemy. But the way it's overcome is it is sort of befriended. And death becomes this sort of educator where I am totally addicted to holding on to my own life, my own power, my own strength. In weakness, sickness, pain, even my own incapacity to be holy on my own, and finally dying is like this education that loosens my grip on myself so that I can be more fully open-handed to receive the life of Jesus Christ. So 2 Corinthians begins where Paul talks about how he and his companions, things had gone poorly. And he says he and his companions had the sentence of death written in their soul. And he says, this happened so that we might trust in the power of the one who raises the dead. And I think we just blow over that, right? He truly sees suffering and hardship as a kind of education, as something that loosens our grip on the very thing we're addicted to that separates us from Christ. What is it Ethan is addicted to that separates him from Christ? Well, it's Ethan.
Right.
And when my weakness is manifested to me in certain ways, it can either be experienced as just loss, victimhood, suffering, senseless, or it can become a place where I become less addicted to hanging on to myself and my power, and I'm opened up more to Jesus Christ. So at that first level, it's kind of experienced as I need to die or become less so that he becomes more.
Yes.
But as we grow in that process, then we learn this, that even that experience of the loss of my own power, the loss of my own ability to be holy, the loss of my ability to keep myself and my loved ones alive, that too is taking part in Jesus Christ's life. Even that is not really a separation from Christ that has to go away. Even that experience of loss is something that unites me to him in his own dying.
So to kind of go back specifically to the verse to connect with what you're saying here is we were talking about before that we're all perishable, we're all mortal. Mm-hmm. So we could say, using the language here, that we always carry about death in our bodies, mm-hmm. right? We all recognize that, right? We mm-hmm. carry about death in our bodies. We feel it every single day in our weakness and our perishability, our need for food, our need for sustenance, all that mm-hmm. kind of stuff. But here it's not just now that we're carrying about death, mm-hmm. but he's actually caring about the death of Jesus now. Mm-hmm. So something has happened he's experiencing weakness and pain and suffering, but now it's not just the human condition. No. It's not just perishability. It's the death of Jesus, right?
It's fellowship Jesus, with God.
Yes. And so in some sense, Jesus himself, through his incarnation, through his crucifixion, through his resurrection, has actually transformed the entire human being and the human experience mm-hmm. such that these human things are now filled with Christ, right? And now death is no longer something that just marks us, but it is a door, right? It's in some sense a passage through whereby, as you said, we learn to let go of ourselves and embrace the life of Christ. We might even say, and we said it a couple of times here before, but I just want to reiterate because it's important, is we're going to lose everything anyway.
Yeah, it's
that
going
death
to happen.
is going to take us anyway. But through the practice of joining in the way of Christ, in approaching that cross, learning to die to ourselves in terms of even the basic things like our appetites, and right, then we learn that we can not hold the door shut as long as possible and then have it broken in and being victims to death. But we actually discover that this is a way in which Jesus meets us.
Yes.
He meets us here. We find him here, and we actually will find life there through that practice.
So a church father we often talk about on this show, Maximus the Confessor, he sums it up so well in just this one line. He says famously, Jesus Christ gave death a new use. I love that, a new use. So we're not just saying human weakness and suffering and loss and death, perishability, has a different meaning now. There's a different relationship to it. We're not simply victims of these things. We can actually turn these things into tools of our own transformation. And fasting is a really important way to do this. So whereas before, we related to death simply as you know, unless we commit suicide in this merely passive way. It's something that we suffer. It's nothing but loss. But we can get this sort of active relationship to it where it becomes a free thing. So how do I want to say this? I lost my train of thought, and I apologize. So how do we change that? So what we do, well, let me back up. So we can either suffer it that way, and actually, you know, for a lot of people, suffering pain and weakness and illness, it hardens their heart. It hardens their separation from Christ. It makes us cling to ourselves ever more tightly. And in the face of the fact that we're weak doesn't make us turn to Christ. It actually just makes us sort of despair and give up, and it's sad. But there can be this active relationship where the suffering of loss and weakness softens our hearts, opens them up, and actually opens us up to Christ. We don't need just a different understanding. We need a different relationship to suffering and weakness, and one we need to practice that. So this is one of the things fasting does. We talked about already that fasting demonstrates to us our weakness. It demonstrates to us our perishability. Sometimes it hurts. But by doing kind of like a controlled, voluntary experience of weakness, of perishability, by separating ourselves from food or certain kinds of food for a time, we can actually practice relating to our own suffering and weakness in a way that softens and opens the heart rather than hardens. So not just saying, what a cool idea. Paul says Jesus changed the meaning of human suffering and death. And then, boy, I hope that works out well for me in my next big trial. Instead, having rhythms of fasting is, okay, in a controlled way, I'm going to expose myself to my weakness, my perishability, and I'm going to practice having this relationship where it's more and more of me losing my grip on my own power and opening myself up to the presence of Christ, rather than just clamping down on my own power and giving up over the fact that I know that I'm weak.
Yeah. So to try to there's a lot there. It was really good. To try to sum that up, when we first started talking, we said, you know, in our culture today, we know that we are conditioned by death and perishability, but we try to avoid it, right? What we find here is Paul saying now that our relationship is not just one of avoidance and eventual tragedy as we get swallowed up by death, but actually death has a new use, right? And the use is encountering Christ, experiencing Christ. We see that in both of these verses. Just real quick, always caring about the body, not just death, which is the human condition, but now it's the dying of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our body. So now it's not just death, but it's death of Jesus that we can experience, and through that, the life of Jesus.
Yes.
Then second, in verse 11, for the living are constantly being handed over to death. That's perishability. That's everybody experiences that. But look what happens. The living are constantly being handed over to death through Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be manifest in our own flesh. So both of these things go from tragedy, right? The dying that's in our bodies, the handed over to death that we all experience. They all become opened up by Jesus, through Jesus, to become means of experiencing life. And that is what we're saying the life of Christ is about. As he fills our pain, our weakness, our death with himself, there becomes an experience of him, which is our life. And that's what asceticism, that's what fasting, that's what this, as you said, a kind of disciplined approach whereby we get used to practicing experiencing small loss, small suffering, small pain as doorways to Christ, that we learn that the grip of death begins to loosen itself and we begin to experience Christ.
Right. I mean, if you don't practice loss in any way at all, then when it does hit you, whether in big ways like terminal illness or in smaller ways, it's just going to be torment.
Yes.
In some sense, you have to become good at embracing weakness as something that opens you up to Christ. So let me talk about this in very practical ways. When I teach 2 Corinthians, and I'm just talking to people about suffering, not about fasting, but about suffering, I usually say, like, what are you doing with your hard days? Hard days, like you wake up and you know this pain in your back is not going to go away, is a spiritual opportunity. On a day where I feel great, it's not that hard for me to live my life being for others, being joyful, being thankful, right? But on days where, say, my back hurts all day, it's very easy for me, because of my pain, to become the center of my universe. I just seek pity. I want other people's attention. It's easy for me not to be patient with others, and I've got an excuse. My back hurts. But on the days where, and back pain's just an example, on days where, say, your back's killing you, you can wake up and say, you know what, today I'll be determined to be for others, to be patient in spite of this. And what that is not you. That's actually the life of Christ in you. I mean, think about him on the cross, being tortured to death. He's forgiving people. He's praying for people, right? And so it's actually the very hard days that are a spiritual opportunity to become less you and more Christ.
Well, and to be clear about what you're saying, though, there, too, I totally agree with you. But what you're not suggesting, again, is some kind of feat of spiritual heroism.
Not at all.
I got an enormous amount of pain, but I'm going to be like Christ today. It's the fact that when we learn to embrace that vulnerability, not as something that I just passively undergo as a victim, but as a doorway to, again, say, for example, Lord, have mercy on me in this. Lord, find me in this. Lord, give me peace and healing and rest in this. Lord, fill this day with you. Right.
Like chronic physical pain can make you give up on a day and just sort of despair of there being any meaning, any presence to God, right? It can just feel like it's nothing but the frustration of one's own life.
Yes. And so the practice of Lent, which is a conscious awareness of our weakness, or that we come from dust and to dust we will return, right? That even the food that we eat it's all perishable. It's all this sort of passing stuff, right? And we get used to experiencing that loss in that way and practicing in very small, as you said, controlled and disciplined ways, this relationship to our own perishability, to death, to weakness. That practice, that asceticism, that training opens the possibility for us to see what Paul saw, to experience what Paul experienced. Paul's not giving an abstract Christian principle here. He's talking about his experience. What got him to the point to where his own suffering was an experience of Jesus Christ that transformed him and gave him life.
Right.
That this life is now manifest in my body.
Yeah, and so to go back to like what I was talking about, one of the things that fasting does in Lent is we're going to intentionally give ourselves a day or multiple days where our weakness is manifest. And we're going to try to relate to that as totally dependent on Christ, right? We can either do the heroism thing and power through, or we can kind of collapse in self-pity and despair, or we can open ourselves up to the life of Christ with it. But we want to practice that. And so there's a good reason not to wait for just that bad day to hit you, but rather you do something like fasting, manifest the weakness, and find that relationship to it. And here's the thing, I can't tell you exactly what it is with words because it's not really a matter of words and ideas. It's in experience, in practice, that we learn to find the right relationship to our pain, such that it opens us up to Christ. This doesn't mean you need to go hurt yourself, certainly not. Or that when you're sick, you don't get medicine, certainly not. Hard days, suffering, weakness, it's going to come to you one way or another. By all means, go to the doctor, take your medicines, and so forth. But the idea is, I had a conversation with a man at our church. He's a really good man, humble man, and he talked about wanting to be a blessing to his family if he ends up on a deathbed for extended amount of time, wanting to be able to kind of be present to those around him in a way that's a blessing, that's a manifestation of the life of Jesus, even as he's passing. To be almost, they're going to be gathered around him, but he wants to sort of pastorally be there for him, even in that weakened state. Fasting is one of those places where instead of just saying, okay, when I'm really sick, I'm going to try to really be that, and I hope it happens. Fasting becomes a place where we kind of get accustomed to our weakness. And we get accustomed to letting Christ be present to us so that we are blessings to other in this weakness that we kind of control letting it have its way with us for a while, right? And that's this idea. Maximus didn't say Christ gave death a new meaning. He said he gave it a new use. We're not just passive victims of my pain, my suffering, my weakness. We actually become people who can actively take hold of these things as opportunity to be filled with Christ.
That's kind of summed up, just to kind of wrap things up here at the end. It's kind of summed up in Hebrews about the fact that what he has removed is the fear of death. We find that in Hebrews. We had talked, this is first season 1, about Christ as the fish hook and death swallowing up Christ, right? And it's that death has been robbed of its power, right?
Right.
It's been robbed of its power in that sense, and its grip is loosened. And in some sense, what I think is fascinating, we would want to say, just ridding ourselves of death is the solution. But what we actually find here is that in Christ, death becomes how would I say it? The enemy, the wild beast, becomes sort of tamed by Christ.
It's our servant now,
and now becomes the means by which it's means by which we can be transformed, and ultimately, to me, I think this is in some sense wonderful. As we go through that process of death, we are stripped of everything which is ourselves. Right? That is how we attain Christ.
Yes.
That's the only way for us to attain Christ. And so in some sense, death becomes our helper.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, truly, the thing that stands between me and Christ is me, my will, my power. And what looked like this terrible last enemy has now been tamed and turned into a servant. That no matter how bad I am at being a hero of dispossessing myself of myself, life in this world and its struggles and ultimately the mortality of my body will demonstrate it to me and crack me open to Christ. I like to think about it in terms of, I remember being a kid and I was on these really, at the time, seemed like really high monkey bars, and I got kind of stuck, and my dad was like, just let go and fall into my arms, and like, no, right? And eventually the pain in my hands and the weakness just gave way, and I fell into my dad's arms. But I do think the things that we experience in this world as being victimized can be kind of like that gravity and pain in our hands, right?
Yeah.
It can loosen our grip from the very things that keeps us from Christ. And we can practice at it. And that's what Lent is about, actually practicing this. And as we get more accustomed to the fact that the life of Christ comes to us not only despite our weaknesses, but in and through them, you'll find we have more liberation from the sins that haunt us, because so much of that is driven by the fear of death and weakness and suffering.
Right. So in the image, the language in 1 Corinthians, death swallowed up into victory. That's a wonderful image, because we usually think of death swallowing us up. We're swallowed by death, but now death is swallowed up.
Yes.
Right? But death is swallowed up in victory, not only at the end, but even right now. Lent is helping the process by which death gets swallowed up in victory in our life today.
And fasting is something like practicing at taming death.
Yes.
So.
Yeah. Wonderful. Hey guys, we've got 20 days left. We're counting down here until Ash Wednesday, in the beginning of Lent. So get your schedules and your planning on as we prepare for this season.
And by all means, don't be afraid to get on the discussion group. Talk about what you're doing. We're going to try to do this as a community. So,
questions, comments, all that kind of stuff. We look forward to hearing from you all, and let's take this journey together.
Sounds good. Bye.
Bye.